Today's event is focused on cyber compromise facts from the field, insight into a lot of the threat vectors and compromises that Special Agent Scott Augenbaum has experienced. In addition, we'll also add best practices on how to mitigate these threats. With the continued growth of malware and threat vectors, we're fortunate to have with us today 3 experts that will provide you with insights into how to help better secure your enterprises. Our first presenter is Scott Augenbaum. Scott is a special agent at the FBI. He started with the FBI in 1988 in the New York field office, and in October of 2003, he was promoted to Supervisory Special Agent at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. in the Cyber Division, Cybercrime Fraud Unit, and was responsible for managing the FBI's Cyber Task Force program and Intellectual Property Rights program. In 2006, he transferred to Nashville and managed the FBI Memphis Division Computer Intrusion Counterintelligence Squad. Over the past 10 years, he's had the opportunity to provide hundreds of computer intrusion threat briefings with the goal of educating the community on emerging computer intrusion threats and how to not be a victim of a data breach. Joining Scott is Guy Franco. Guy is the CTO and founder of Javelin Networks. He is a highly experienced security researcher and developer. He performed both as red team attack and blue team defense in the cyber division of the Israeli intelligence courts. He's also worked commercially as a security consultant. Highly skilled in the field of forensics and security analysis, Guy has cultivated a world-class repertoire of cyber defense tools and offensive techniques for network application. And joining Guy is Greg Fitzgerald. Greg is a seasoned executive in cybersecurity and has over 20 years experience. Greg is the Chief Operating Officer of Javelin Networks, and most recently, prior to Javelin, was the Chief Marketing Officer for Cylance. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Scott. Scott, I know business email compromise, ransomware, and advanced persistent threats have been common cyber threats in 2017 in terms of what you've seen. Can you give us your perspective on what you've seen in the field in terms of threats as well as best practices?
Sure, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. It's my privilege to be here. I thank my friends over at Javelin for inviting me to take part of this discussion. I became an FBI agent in 1995, and if you would have asked me to define the role of your typical FBI agent in 1995, I would say it was really easy to describe. There were bad people who were doing bad things to good people in my geographical area, which at the time was Syracuse, New York, and my job was to work with state and local law enforcement officers and put bad guys in jail. Fun, exciting job. I was working bank robberies, I was working fugitive cases, I was working drug cases, white-collar cases. I dabbled a little bit into computer crime. 23 years later, if you would ask me to define my job, I can say I do it in one sentence. I teach individuals and organizations how not to be the victim of cybercrime. And, every day there's a new attack vector. There's something else going on there. Nobody remembers WannaCry anymore because of the new variant. And, when I get out and I do so much public speaking, I can boil the last 11 years of my career down into a couple of real major key points. The first one when I speak to individuals and organizations is nobody ever expects to be a victim. And I hear this all the time. Over in Nashville, we're very, very healthcare centric. The smaller healthcare companies tell me that they're not as large as the publicly traded companies. They only have 10 million pieces of information. I hear from companies on the NASDAQ saying, well, nobody would want to target us because we're not on the New York Stock Exchange. When I talk to publicly traded companies, they say, hey, we only have $7 billion in revenues, and the bad guys are targeting $10 billion and above companies, and it goes on and on. And I always tell organizations that, look, everyone has some type of information that people want. And, when we sit down with organizations, or when I sit down and try to have these conversations, even if you don't have intellectual property, everyone has cash. Everyone has access to cache. Everyone has emails. And we're going to talk about that. This, the biggest thing right now is email being weaponized. Really big problem. We all have HR records. So every organization has that. And think about it. As a home computer user, what do we all have? We all have access to cache. And the first thing that I tell corporate America today is, and this is a really hard pill for a lot of organizations and individuals, except the small businesses, to understand. When the bad guys get access to your stuff and steal your stuff, think about what we talked about. What is your stuff? Intellectual property, money, you name it. It boils down to your brand. When the bad guys steal that information and you call me, it's too late. I don't get your stuff back. I was speaking at a big conference couple of months ago, and there was a retired senior executive from the FBI who stopped me afterwards and said, I can't believe you told the American public that we as the FBI aren't going to get your stuff back. And I just looked at him and I said, what about OPM? 21.5 million records stolen by the Chinese government. Anthem, another 88 million records. Healthcare records stolen. Sony, Home Depot, Target, JP Morgan, those 6 breaches were responsible for the theft of almost 500 million pieces of information, credit card information, and we weren't able to get any of that back. And the one thing that they all have in common is I was a victim of all of them. I used to like to joke and say I was a subject matter expert on teaching people how not to be the victim of identity theft, and I really can't do that anymore after being victimized so many times. I do have 4 really good success stories of the business email compromise where the bad guys have tricked an organization into wire transferring money overseas. And I joke with my peers that if there was a Hall of Fame for FBI agents for getting money back, I would go to the Hall of Fame. If I was a baseball team, my record in the past 10 years would be 4 wins, 17,000 losses. The other thing, what else can the bad guys do besides, steal your stuff? The bad guys can absolutely go out and the bad guys can encrypt your stuff. We see a lot of that. The ransomware. We're seeing that happen all the time. And, organizations need to make sure that they're backing up their information. They have good data restoration policies in place because backing up your information isn't necessarily enough. Got to make sure that we can restore it. I've seen so many times when, they weren't able to restore it. But one of the things we haven't seen in the media lately is a hacking group, Dark Overlord. While everything's been going on with WannaCry, this group has gotten into healthcare organizations, stole their information, and even if you had your stuff backed up, they've exfiltrated it. So we have to remember when we start talking about ransomware, the fact that if they're able to get access to your stuff, you cannot be safe that it hasn't been stolen. And there's besides patching, there's a lot of technical solutions that are out on the market. So the bad guys, get your stuff, we don't get it back. When I started as an FBI agent, I put bad guys in jail. Today, a majority of the bad guys are located overseas, far outside of the jurisdiction of the United States government. Right now, if you would go to the FBI's website, fbi.gov, and look for cyber, you would see the top 25 list of cyber criminals. And if you can pronounce any of their names perfectly, I will take you out to dinner. Nobody here is located within the United States. We have FBI agents over at probably in excess of 80 embassies throughout the world where we are invited guests of the host government. We don't have arrest powers. We don't have subpoena powers. And on a lot of these cases, they don't have laws. We don't have extradition treaties. So right now, after talking for 10 minutes, you're probably saying, wow, thanks for bringing this guy on. What did we learn today? That the FBI is not getting your stuff back. The chances of us putting bad guys in jail are really slim to none, and I kind of keep my motivation up in my voice. The thing that drives me to do my job is 90% of what I deal with could have been prevented. Right now, I walk out and I don't deal with situations where I go like this, wow, that was really, really sophisticated. Because, you know, even though we have what's known as the advanced persistent threat, I don't think they really need to take their tools out of their tool bag, because what I've been witnessing is the bad guys have been attacking a number of business processes. They've been the business email compromise, probably one of the worst things that I've seen hit $5 billion worth of fraud in the past 18 months. And it comes in a couple of different types of variations. You know, the first one is bad guy gets into the CFO's email account, sends an email over the controller and says to the controller, I'd like you to wire transfer X number of dollars to this bank. What does the controller do when they get that email? They wire transfer the money. So, you know, there are different things that organizations are doing to prevent that, you know, such as on your email gateway, making sure that if the email is from an external sender, it's actually an external sender. So the bad guys cannot spoof that email. So if you're getting an email that looks like it's coming from the CEO and it's really from a Gmail account, you're able to stop that from sending that. What are a couple of the other variations? I've seen one that just happened a couple of weeks ago. Organization, which is a large organization, the person in accounts payable, they receive an email from a legitimate vendor, and it says you owe $3.5 million. The legitimate bill comes in. What does the person do who gets it? They go through the process. They pay out that information. But all of a sudden, an hour later, another email comes in. That email looks legitimate, and the email purports to be from the same vendor saying, so sorry, we made a mistake. We overcharged you. Instead of charging you $3.5 million, we really only meant to charge you $3.49 million. Please rip up the old invoice and pay the new invoice. At that point in time, what does the employee do? The employee does her job and takes that money and wire transfers it to the bank account. I get called in probably 10 days later, because what happens? The original vendor says, hey, we never got paid. It goes back and forth. Yes, I did. No, we didn't. The investigation was conducted to determine it was a fraudulent email. The money went over to the Middle East. We contacted my agent over there directly. He contacted local law enforcement, and all the money was wire transferred from there over to Nigeria. Just had one the other day. The bad guys got into the corporate email account of the vendor, just kind of like in the whole Target attack. They're getting into the third parties. And at that point, just sent an email, read all the emails, understood the business processes within the organization, sent the organization an email going, hey, I need to change our bank account information. Here's our new bank account. And all of a sudden that gets entered into the system. When it's time to pay the $500,000 invoice, they send the money to the wrong account. Bad guys, they are absolutely killing us right now. One of the other ones that I see, it was a variation of the IRS, the W-2 scam. Usually during tax season, what will happen? Your new person in your payroll unit, payroll department will get an email that looks like it's coming from the CFO. It'll say, hey, I need all the W-2 information for every one of the employees. What does an employee do when they get that information? They respond to that email thinking that they responded to the CFO, and somewhere over in an internet cafe over in West Africa, you know, a cyber criminal gets up and jumps for joy saying that he has now obtained 2,000 pieces of PHI or PII belonging to U.S. citizens, and he sells them to his cohorts, 3 for $10, 7 for $20. So that is all that information is worth. And, you know, and I sit down with a lot of organizations and I go over these business processes. And, you know, and when we're dealing with information security, it really no longer starts with the Chief Information Security Officer or the CIO. It's the entire organization. It is getting people involved. It's having these trainings. It's understanding. We're not going to be able to stop these attacks. One of the things we can do is we can stop and react on, or we can teach our employees how to react to that. I want everyone here, think about it. In your organization, how would your employees handle these situations? Because at the end of the day, it could potentially be one of your, some of your information. One of the worst breaches that I think that's out there that I like to joke and say is a little underrated is the Yahoo breach. And everyone goes, Yahoo, why was Yahoo so bad? Well, what happened in the Yahoo breach? 1 billion usernames and passwords were stolen by what we believed was Russian organized crime. So they have all these usernames and passwords of Yahoo users. So let's stop and think about this for a second. You know, everyone goes, so what? It wasn't my date of birth. There was no credit card information. Well, if we stop and think about Yahoo, you know, if you look at the 1 billion Yahoo users, let's take a guess. What percentage happen to own an iPhone? You know, let's go on the low end. 10%, that's 100 million. Even if you went to 1%, what is that? 10 million or less than that? 10 million. And if the bad guys would take that username and password for Yahoo and they would go to www.icloud.com, what percentage of users are they going to get into? There's a lot of reports out there that are saying that 60 to 70% of the population happens to use the same password for multiple platforms. So think about that. How many corporate Dropbox accounts were located that the bad guys were able to do that? And that's how I see a lot of data breaches are taking place because, you know, the bad guys are popping these Dropbox accounts. Think about the cloud accounts and all those things. So when I'm going out and I'm doing, basic Cyber 101, the most important thing is we need to have separate passwords for our mission critical platforms. We cannot have the same password for multiple platforms because that is what I see the bad guys are able to capitalize on that information. And what else is mission critical? What about anything that we're buying that happens to be from the Internet of Things? You know, the next time you go to Best Buy and you go, wow, I really want to get one of those cool garage door openers that I can have an app with. Well, you have to register it on a website. What if you're using the same password on Yahoo? To me right now, a majority of the attacks that I see are really being done via email because today all the bad guys have to do is get access to your email account. I got an email probably a couple of weeks ago from a CEO of a mid-size organization, and it said, Scott, I'd like you to review this document. Well, I don't have a relationship with this individual. I looked up and I sent an email to the guy I know within the organization. And I said, hey, I think you have a problem. And he kind of responded back nonchalantly. He went, oh, yeah, it's not a big deal. You know, the CEO's email was compromised. We nipped it in the bud. And I said, okay. So I took the document back. It was a PDF. I took it back. I opened it up in a virtual machine, which is a safe environment. I looked at the PDF, and what was it? An HTML file. And it said there was a DocuSign. It was a DocuSign document which I needed to enter in my Microsoft 365 credentials. I want everyone to think about this. Do you need to enter in your 365 credentials to access a DocuSign contract? Who knows? I mean, but think about it in your organizations. Think about individuals who get these contracts. Would they enter in their 365? So I asked a couple of guys I knew in the industry to plug this in, and I see that he sent it all over town. So now I'm like, look, I got to call them back. I got to really let them know. And I said, look, guys, I think you have a data breach. Let me tell you, that is never a good day, no matter how good of friends we are, when I call you up and say, I think you have a really severe problem. And I said, he goes, well, it was just the email. But what was the email connected to? The OneDrive. What did they have in the OneDrive? The crown jewels of the organization. And that's why right now, the advice that I give to most corporations is, if you are not using two-factor authentication on your email, because right now, today's data breach that I see happens to be a compromise of the Microsoft 365, which leads to the OneDrive. If you are not taking advantage of those features, the bad guys will get access to your stuff and wreak havoc. And that's why we need to also have this done on our personal side too, because I have seen, the bad guys get into a Facebook account that didn't have two-factor authentication. From there, they got into the corporate email account and they did all of their really bad things. The other myth too is, organizations are using a VPN to log in. And I always like to say, what happens if I get your VPN credentials? What can I do with that information? Another question I get all the time is the cloud safe? I love to bring that up when I'm at IT conferences, because I can always tell the IT vendors, they all get really nervous. And I'm like, nobody's attacking the cloud. And then everyone goes, okay. I go, they don't need to attack the cloud. They need to just get your username and password. There's a great website out there called Twofactor, TWOFACTORAUTH.org, which lists the platforms that you can do it on. Whenever I give these talks, I always tell organizations, I know I'm not going to be able to change corporate culture, but on the end user side, I can really give you information, because most people really do not think about that. Intrusion detection systems, the bad guys are writing so many new viruses every single day. The reports are just so incredibly high that it is a game of race that is out there. So intrusion detection systems, very, very important, but we have to realize that they are only as effective as the known viruses are out there. Patch management, very, very challenging for organizations. When it comes down, a lot of times when I'm sitting down with the C-suites of organizations, I go like this: what's your information security strategy? And they rattle off a lot of appliances, and I'm like, those are controls. What are you doing as an organization to really prevent these bad things from happening? There's a couple of things that I really like. People go like this. I follow NIST, and I go, I've met very few people who can read 470 pages of the NIST 53 guideline. The critical security controls, unbelievable starting point for any organization. And what are the critical security controls? Knowing what is on your network. That's probably the first thing. Application whitelisting. You should not be having your core critical servers, talking to things they shouldn't be. Reducing administrative privileges and patch management. Also, there's something out there called the Australian 8, which is a breakdown of the top 20. When I go over and I provide talks to different organizations, I always, I get in there with the C-suites. We always ask, well, what's the most important piece of information that you need to protect, and build your security strategy around that. We have a public-private, the FBI. One of the things that we're trying to do is so important, our outreach getting out. People always say, well, when should we call the FBI when we suspect there's an incident? When there's ransomware and you lose money, you call us. When your credit card information is stolen or your intellectual property is stolen, we really call you. And that's why it's so important to sit here and develop your intrusion response plan. Like I said, our InfraGard chapters, it's our public-private alliance. That's infragard.org. There's a lot of really great information out there. We have chapters in probably 90 cities. Get to know your FBI cyber squads in each of our major field offices. Because, the knowledge base that we have within our head doesn't serve us any good unless we're actually out there and communicating to the private sector. Look at, what are your most important things? What are the things you're going to hear about today is your Active Directory. I have seen situations where the bad guys have stolen your Active Directory. I have explained that to an organization and they still didn't get it. And that's also something else. So really have, understand that. And that's what you're going to learn on the second part of our seminar today. So let me just kind of sum it up in a really couple of key points that I highlighted today. It's important to know that you know what you need to protect. Understand what are your business processes. I always tell organizations, it's important to think before you click, when you get those emails, but we need to think before we act. When we are changing sensitive financial information, very, very important. We need to make sure that we have separate passwords from mission-critical accounts. We can't have one password being stolen without, compromising all the other passwords in the organization. Two-factor authentication, in my opinion, that would have solved almost that, and thinking before you act would have solved the majority of my business email compromise investigations. Now, I've thrown a lot of information out at you. There's a lot of good information on the FBI website. And also the other thing is I'm wrapping up over here, patching, very, very important. The organizations, we had a 60-day window before WannaCry was released. So I've kind of, my goal here today was, kind of a sales presentation. My sales pitch was to try never, ever to meet you as the victim of a crime. And a lot of the tools that are available are out there, but we need to start with the basics. It's back to basics. The things that I see today are no different than the things that I've seen 7 or 8 years ago, except our attack surface has widened. And with that, I will turn it back over.
Thanks, Scott. That was a great presentation, highly informative. And without further ado, I will turn the session over to Greg Fitzgerald. Greg?
I'm Greg Fitzgerald. Just quickly introduce Javelin Networks. Scott, thank you so much for the introduction. I think you've brought a couple of really good points that we would like to talk about as the second half of this session. That being the importance of credentials. Usernames and passwords in particular are so simple for attackers to use, and they use them as legitimate kind of improvisation of the individual that has them, right? They don't have to brute force things. They don't have to do as much as we anticipate in terms of this attack. But let's think about it. We have Guy Franco on, who's going to get into a little bit further depth as an attacker himself and a defender himself, who's been military trained to both practice and observe for the defense of this, where they understand what the attacker is doing. So we'll get into attacker's mindset. But briefly, as we get into this, one of the things I want to talk about is why are there more compromised companies now at a time when there are more cybersecurity products in the world ever? In my 23 years of being in the business, on the vendor side, it's been interesting to go from just simple, username, passwords, and some encryption to now a plethora of defense in depth and an enormous number of marketing cliches and words and claims. And the problem we have today, and I'm sure all of you relate to this, which is I'm overwhelmed. Everybody's saying the same thing. They all claim they fixed the problem. And the reality is they don't. There's an enormous gap in the coverage of technologies and what they say and what they do. The reality of today, as Scott just mentioned, is that the attackers are doing a lot of reconnaissance. Their actual practice is to observe who they want to attack, how the business processes work, what are the applications they use, anything that I can use that is native, or we call it living off the land, right? Don't create something new that can be observed. Don't try to act abnormal because user behavior might detect that. Act as the company and the organization naturally behaves. And by doing so, they orient themselves with the number of users, the departments, the devices, the user groups, like you said, the emails, the common personnel, the common practices of invoicing and payments, anything they can do to get normalized. Decide how they're actually going to proceed through the organization, and then they actually do their damage. And if you look at the past attacks over the past 3 years, and in particular this week alone with the Petya ransomware approach, everything is oriented around credential theft. Credential theft leads to lateral movement, meaning the ability to move off the machine they have compromised and into the organization to other machines. And in today's world, 9 out of 10 organizations have a Microsoft Active Directory. That directory is literally nothing more than a database of every user, every computer, every application, every password, anything and everything about that organization. And that is the attacker's secret. Because with reconnaissance, what they're doing is they're just taking simple steps to gather information and knowledge about what's happening in that organization. Because in reality, when they send a piece of malware, or they're hoping you click on something, the reality is they don't know where they land, because it's a spam activity, right? And you don't know if it's Sally the secretary or Charlie the CEO. And frankly, they don't know if it's anybody in between. But when they land, they have to get oriented about what computer they're on, what privileges that computer has, and what it's connected to. And then they start scanning the environment using native commands, native queries to mostly the Active Directory to say, who am I on, where can I go, and how do I do so undetected? And then they use a stolen credential that is that person's credential to then gain access and maintain their presence in the organization, and then they cover their tracks. And that's the hard part about the reconnaissance effort, is that, about the recovery effort, is that the attackers cover their tracks very fast. Most people know about the attack kill chain, but if we look at it from the way the attacker actually proceeds, prevention is just a very small component. It's like having a high wall on a fortress, right? But once you get in there, you're inside the fort, and you have to do internal reconnaissance. You have to figure out a way to, again, find a way to make your presence persistent, and then to move off and around. Now, what's happening is only after I perform that activity as an attacker is the possible chance of you catching me from the act of what I've done. That's the detection technologies you're buying. So between prevention and detection, there's a huge gap of where technologies do not cover today. And there are a lot of claims that say, oh, we could do this, we could do that. The reality is no technology today is able to detect a person that's acting like a real person using native applications in the right way, meaning that's not abnormal. It just means it could be me. It's like an insider threat. I could just decide the force goes from the good force to the bad force, and all of a sudden I'm doing things badly. And that's one of the biggest problems in today's technology world today. Now, as a premise to this, we're defending ourselves significantly at the endpoint using authentication, firewalls, malware preventions, user behavior, and endpoint detection response. Again, needed, but not sufficient, right? Necessary, but not sufficient. Because as we look at this, once I get on that machine, it's really easy to query what I need to query. And why is that? So what we're educating you on is to be very cognizant of the directories, the file servers, the databases that you have in your organization, because that's what gives people information. It may not be where the targeted valuables are, but it's certainly where they can get the information to remain undetected and impersonate the source. So then people go, wait a minute, I've got all these technologies, it should alert and alarm everything else. That indeed is a problem itself. As we learned around Target and even Home Depot and others, the detection of the act of the attacker was actually alerted on. The problem was alert overwhelming. They didn't know what was important, and there are way too many false positives. And so now I often tell people, does anybody even pay attention in a parking lot if a car alarm goes off? Typically the answer is no. Why? Because there's nobody stealing the car. Somebody bumped into it, somebody accidentally turned it on, and so people have gotten numb to alerts and alarms. Same thing is happening in the cybersecurity world. And so even if an attacker tries to brute force their way through all these systems, most of the time they'll be ignored. So what does the attacker do? They also try to impersonate and make sure they can maintain their persistence, because they don't want those alarms going off. So let me turn it over to a true expert here, Guy Franco. Guy, you take over, explain what you see and why you built Javelin from a real user's perspective. What was the problem that you saw and how you were trained, and then how you were working in the commercial sector to defend governments and organizations that was not possible with today's technologies?
Sure. Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much for the presentation. So I'll do a quick brief about myself. I came from the intelligence corps in Israel. I served there for about 8 years. So I've been in many positions there, starting from red team, attacking, offensive, and afterwards I actually became blue, and I did a lot of research regarding forensics, and I learned a lot about how most attackers execute their attack, how they plan their attack successfully, and this is basically knowledge that I gained from the Army. I can honestly say that when I started learning this field, it wasn't very well known on how exactly good attacks, basically very good attackers work. And there was a lot of misconception on how exactly it works. Many times they say, okay, they spend a lot of research in efforts to find 0 days and vulnerabilities to be able to infiltrate to almost every computer on the network. But when I got to the Army, I was really surprised that most of the attacks are using very, very, I would say, easy to learn methods. And when you get the hang of it and you learn exactly how basically every IT infrastructure in the world, in every company works, you can execute the same plan over and over again without changing much of the way you actually gather information and you get to the right assets. So the concept behind it is first of all, when you get into a computer basically that is connected to the domain, you are halfway there. From there, you have free ability to query almost everything you want from the infrastructure, even without any sort of privileges. So the first thing I'll usually do is to query the Active Directory to find out who are the high privileges account. So instead of knocking on doors and trying to figure out what are the applications that are vulnerable in the environment in order to try to make an intrusion there, it's much easier to find the people that has the keys for the entire kingdom. Basically, those are the admins in the network. So admins have full privileges to almost every sort of asset inside the environment. Even if they don't have a specific permission to get, for example, to cloud environments like Salesforce and others, they still can use their privileges to move around to another computer in the network that, for example, the CFO is connected to and perform the action using his credentials. So basically, it's all about adapting yourself to the situation, and as long as you have domain admin credentials, you basically have the free regime to do whatever you want inside the network. So to gain domain admins, there are all sorts of ways to do it. Basically, I can use some of the way the infrastructure works. Basically, most of companies today are using the same local administrator on each and every PC. The reason that they do that is because they're creating the same kind of image on each and every machine they're installing the operating system. So for me, I just need to find out who are the admins in the network, where are they connected to, and using local admin traversal, I can get to their PC and then dump the credentials of the current connected user and act as the admin. When I'm admin, I basically can do whatever I want. I can move around to almost any assets inside the environment without any sort of problem. So using the stolen credentials, I can then query almost everything inside the environment, find where are the most important applications of the organization. I can, again, use the Active Directory mostly for this information. I can ask what applications are there for what servers, what are the important computers and servers inside the environment, and from there, it's basically very easy steps to gain what I want and get out without ever being found, without ever being discovered. Greg, can you please move on?
Yeah, so now we can describe what we are trying to do here. Is that the key is if you can change the perception of what the attacker sees, then what they interact with is not real. To them, they think it's real and they're doing all the activity. However, the organization is protected, and that's the Javelin strategy for what we've created with the product. So if we look at that, we'll look at how this kind of lays itself out a bit. Javelin product is called AD Protect. AD Protect is a tool that helps stop the reconnaissance, stop the credential theft, and stop the lateral movement. It's an endpoint product that is in a agentless fashion, meaning you don't have like a .exe like you do with antivirus or other tools that is chewing up memory usage, CPU usage, processor usage, and basically burdening the endpoint, to be honest, and how those technologies work. Instead, it's an image, an artificial image of the Active Directory that immediately detects false movement activity by an errant attacker. If someone is a legitimate user, they won't be hitting these objects within the memory of the computer. You know, they are already attached to the real objects or real applications that they would normally use in a workday. However, an attacker's perspective is coming in differently, and as they start to query for information, they are building this directory and this list of items that they want to interact with. And so the minute they touch something, they get detected. Then what happens is autonomously, meaning without having to have the full force of personnel and data collection and aggregation of logs and everything else, it's able to take immediate action to mitigate that attacker on that machine, meaning it can kick the attacker off. It can kick the machine off the network. It can even just watch and observe the attacker while it's collecting all this forensics evidence, but knowing that the attacker is never getting reconnaissance information that's going to be useful for them to enter the organization. And that whole piece helps automate the security orchestration that today is so burdensome. As the latest report from Verizon came out, you know, it's about 149 days but by the time they actually detect an attacker, right? That's crazy. An attacker only needs seconds. They don't need days, weeks, or months. And if you can stop them at the point of how that's where the effort and activity should occur. And again, today's technologies are not taking place in that fashion. So how architecturally, to take a quick look at it, we call it infinite deception and an agentless presence, in the sense that the infinite deception is this: it is globally scalable. The beautiful piece about an image that sits on an endpoint's memory is that it's just an image. It's just a picture. It happens to have real data, but it's not legitimate data for the attacker to see. It can be distributed very simply through the computer's normal authentication with the Active Directory. So any computer that has to connect to the corporate network, as Scott mentioned, through a VPN as an example, has to be authenticated and allowed to come in. It's at that point that the Javelin image of this false directory gets injected into the computer. What's beautiful about that is even if the attacker got on the machine at, say, Starbucks or the airport or some other location, the only good they have is to be on that physical single machine. It is no good to them unless they connect to the network. And once they get connected to the network, what happens is that they start to query these directories and see where can they go next. And that is when the Javelin interrupts that process. And what's beautiful is that there is no additional infrastructure that is required. If you look at other technologies that are trying to do deception or to do something similar to this fashion, it takes an enormous amount of work. You have to usually configure the directory. You usually have to manually input new servers and new computers and create what we know as honeypots. A honeypot doesn't work, and again, Guy can explain why. It's easily observable because it's not dynamic. It doesn't change, and if they do want to make it change in dynamic, it's a very manual effort for the IT staff. And so the beautiful part about Javelin's architecture is that it doesn't require any of that. It's also autonomous. We use artificial intelligence and machine learning not to necessarily make it completely smarter, but to make the human activity and burden of defense much easier. Because in today's world of technology, you can be more effective in detection and alerting. But if you're more operationally burdensome, that is not a technology to take on. Why? Because each and every one of us on the phone know that we don't have enough staff who have enough skill and enough time to just keep up with the maintenance of the products we have. And that's the biggest problem with security technology today. So what's beautiful about Javelin has been architected in a very simple and elegant fashion to enable a much higher detection quality as well as a much lower operational impact, both to the user and the IT staff. So as we summarize here, after Javelin, Guy, take over and you can describe exactly now what happens for the attacker.
Sure, of course. So whenever now an attacker is getting into a computer basically that Javelin is protecting, each and every step of his way is going to meet the Javelin mask topology of the entire environment. Starting from user reconnaissance, basically they are going to see many more user admins that most of them are not real. If they will try to query more about the admins, or they will try to gain more information or try to brute force the admin, they will immediately be caught by our system, and basically the forensics and the containment phases will kick in that basically will contain the attack right at the point of breach. Moving on to computer querying, computer reconnaissance, this phase will also probably fail because most of the assets they are going to see will be false. Basically, they're going to see many more servers, application, computers that most of them are not real, and all are custom made for the environment that Javelin is deployed. Basically, they will see the same naming scheme, the same attributes, the same kind of information that usually this environment contains, but only on a larger amount of objects. Now, when they will try to move upon each of the objects to try to perform a lateral movement, at this point, they will fail, and we will call them again and launch again the forensics and the containment phases.
Great, thank you very much. That's good information there, Guy, is what eventually happens. So the short and sweet of it is, before Javelin, they know every single M&M you've got. They know every color. They know every person, user, application, and they use all of that native, natural, existing information to cause you harm. If you install Javelin, you've got an intermix that is just hard to identify what's real, what's not. And the minute you touch one of those things, you're alerted upon, you're mitigated and prevented and contained from causing further harm. So I know we're at the end of the hour. There are some questions that wanted to be asked. So Jeff, take over, and thank you very much, audience, for listening.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Guy. Great presentations. Real quick, I'm going to go ahead and launch our last polling question while we jump into the Q&A. We've got quite a few questions that have come in. I think this first one is for Scott. Scott, you know, there are a couple of people actually that were curious how often you end up contacting businesses versus businesses contacting you regarding a breach.
In the tradition, when we're dealing with ransomware, when there's an availability issue or money is gone, you find out about that. But whenever there has been situations, I don't have companies calling me up telling me all of their information has been stolen. Either I get contacted by a third party, or we come across the information where somebody will say, hey, we found all of this information on the dark web. Now, that's never a good day, because that means that stuff has left your network and you are not aware of that. So that's a very big, important thing. So we're working a big point of sale malware case. We've been contacting victims. Hey, you got a problem. They have no idea. That, to me, is very concerning.
Thanks, Guy. We've got some other questions that have come in, maybe of a little more technical nature. So maybe, Guy, these would be targeted to you. Would you recommend a non-flat network for critical systems?
Yes, of course. So segmentation is always a good recommendation inside every network. I don't say it's necessarily possible to do it, but as long as you keep small segmentation, basically most of the lateral movement attempts can be blocked. And basically it's a good way to control and the environment. Yeah, I do.
Great, thanks. This is interesting because a few people were actually inquiring about the same general topic, and that is, if I have antivirus and endpoint protection, am I really not protected? Scott, do you want to touch on that first? I think you elaborated on that quite a bit in your presentation.
Well, it's only as good as the known signatures that are out there. The bad guys are always writing new viruses, which means it takes a while for the intrusion detection systems to pick up on these things. So traditional antivirus on the signature-based, really, you need it, but it's, you know, and I see different things. I had a situation where somebody sent me an email with a link, and we took it back, we opened it up into a virtual machine, and when we clicked on the link, you can't see it with the naked eye, it connected to a web server over in Eastern Europe, and it attempted to exploit a vulnerability that was on we ran it against 10 commercially available antiviruses, and 7 of them didn't pick it up. And we do it all the time, and I wish I could come out and say, well, this one picks it up more than others. It's really not that. It's not that. You know, if you were going to click on every single link that you can, you're going to have an issue. So that's why, you know, doing it in either a sandboxed environment such as a Citrix, or when I go over and I speak to organizations, one of the things that I always say is, you know, you should have a completely separate computer for your banking and finance. If 90% of what you're dealing with happens to be done through either email attachments, clicking on links, or going to a website, you can get yourself the best computer you can for $300 and use it in a bootable Linux CD and only use it for banking and finance. No mission critical Facebook, no mission critical Pinterest.
Great, thanks, Scott. Greg and Guy, before I turn that over to you for your answer to that question, Just real quick to the audience, I know we're a couple minutes past the hour, but we still have quite a few questions that are coming in. So we're going to go ahead and continue to answer the questions, and you're welcome to stay on with us. Okay, Greg, do you want to take your, give your take of that question?
Well, yeah, having built, Cylance as one of the premier endpoint security products, and I still represent it as an advisor to the company. It's a fantastic tool, and I think you absolutely have to have preventive measures. There's no doubt. As Scott knows, we have to do all we can to prevent the attack in the first place. But we also have to be extremely conscious and not foolhardy to assume that that is the end-all, be-all prevention. And the detection tools that we have, frankly, that exist today in the market are very laborious. I mean, they require data collection, they aggregation. I mean, yes, there's trying to be a lot of automation being played into this, into Splunk and other things. But again, the time delay is just irresponsible, to be honest, in terms of how they function and act. And so therefore, it's not sufficient for what's needed. I think I'm kind of more the marketing guy. So really, the person that needs to answer this one is Guy, who's going to tell you exactly the answer, I think, from a technical perspective.
Yes, thank you, Greg. So it's enough just to look at the statistic of how exactly, how many viruses, like malware, in the wild are actually being stopped by antiviruses. And the statistics are about like 30% of all the malwares are actually prevented. So you need to really think about how good the preventive measurement can get inside your environment. So antiviruses, next generation endpoints, firewalls, IPSs, they're only good until a point where they can't really defend against all variants of malwares. And even known malware can take all sorts of obfuscation that would take the binary to a completely different signature in terms of the antivirus. So it's good to have preventive measurements, but you always need to remember that there are really good odds that stuff are going to get in, and it's inevitable. And you should always assume that you're going to be breached. And it's a good thinking, and it's also gives you the possibility to think of ways to find and detect once they're in. If you just rely on preventative tool, you'll most likely lose. No matter what kind of endpoint security or antivirus or the best firewall in the world, they probably won't help you to mitigate all the risks. And you always need to think, what are you going to do when you are getting breached?
Great, thanks, Guy. Hey, Scott, I know you did potentially have a hard stop coming up, so it looks like the next questions are really focused on Javelin. So if you need to drop off, no problem. You gave a great presentation today, and I wanted to thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I'd rather spend an hour with your folks, just trying to prevent them from being a victim, and I appreciate it, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you in this great discussion.
Oh, you're welcome. The next question is, what if a network admin needs to run AD commands from his or her laptop? How does Javelin interact with that scenario?
So, good question. Let's first put the cards on the table. Most of the organization, like 99% of the users, an application doesn't really need the entire view of the directory services. So we're looking at a very small percentage of the actual enterprise organization that actually needs some kind of querying mechanism for usually either auditing or managing IT infrastructure. So in terms of our solution, the way it works is that admins has the ability, only their user accounts has the ability to shut down the mass topology on their computers for a certain amount of times in order to perform the query, and it's all happened basically without any sort of user intervention, which is pretty cool. The way it works is pretty much with the smart whitelisting that our system is doing automatically, together with some user intervention regarding re-entering the credentials in order to perform the queries again.
Great, thanks, Guy. The next question, and Scott, if you're still on, this might apply to you as well, but would it be a good idea to block IP addresses from all countries except the U.S. for uninitiated traffic through our UTM? You know, I guess the first consideration with that is if you're only doing business in the U.S., then that might make sense. But if you're an international or global organization, you know, that might be a difficult consideration. Guy, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it could be probably a good way to block attacks, usually that are unsophisticated. It's very easy today, you know, to obtain an IP address on the US, whether through all sorts of proxying or using even AWS, for example. So a lot of command and control servers are not even being deployed on the East. It's American servers placed in the cloud of basically CDN networks. And I don't think really that you can block every IP address in the world because, as I mentioned today, many of the cloud environments are placed even in Europe, so blocking it completely probably will harm the business.
Yeah. Great, thanks. There's another question that came in. Should I cancel my BYOD program? Scott, are you still on the line? Okay, I think Scott had to drop off, but Guy, do you have a perspective on that? Do you think BYOD, or bring your own device, creates unnecessary risk?
I think BYOD is probably the future of IT and computers, and no one can argue about it. And it imposes even more risks than the actual infrastructure that we are living in today, because it means that you're necessarily connected anywhere and from everywhere. So it's much more easier to attack devices because they're always off the network, and we still have full access to the infrastructure. So in these terms, it indeed imposes more risks. And you need to really see it very carefully on how much let's call it privileges, or how much access would you give those devices. Another thing, you should also always consider stuff that will enable us safe access to the internal networks, either through sandboxing through the phone, which nowadays there are a lot of technology that are doing virtualization over the phone, and it could really help this situation, because once you're running from a sandbox that is separated from the actual operating system on the device, you're able to cut yourself from any malware that is basically installed on your phone. So BYOD is probably the future, and every organization should think very carefully on how are they going to connect it to their infrastructures.
All right, we've got a couple more questions, and then we need to wrap things up. The next question, again, this is fairly technical, and Guy, and you probably have a good perspective on that. Is it possible to disable encryption capability on Windows PCs? Behavior mitigation, that is.
I'm not sure I quite understand the problem. Disabling?
Yeah, it's kind of phrased oddly. Maybe we can, we'll reach out to that attendee and ask for clarification on that. And then the other question is there a known way to plug into, or I'm assuming integrate with Google Apps for organizations, I'm assuming to identify a bad IP list of sorts, preventing known crap from being delivered. So I'm assuming from preventing known documents and or maybe phishing attempts from being delivered.
Again, I'm not sure I quite understand. To use Google for what? The Google Apps for what? For preventing?
Yeah, I think what they're asking is there a way to integrate with Google Apps to, you know, potentially prevent maybe phishing attempts and you know, from bad IPs or preventing traffic from bad IPs if they're a Google Apps company? Is there a way to integrate with that to prevent that?
I'm not sure. I think you need to be part of the Google basically cloud mailing in order to get their reputation regarding the IP addresses. So I'm not sure you can proxy your emails through Google. It's something I haven't heard before.
Okay. All right, great. Well, thanks everybody for attending today. Guy and Greg, thank you very much for your informative presentations. I think it was very enlightening. And everyone, please watch your inboxes for an invite to our next webinar on best practices in cybersecurity.
Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.